The hand moved. That was the first thing Zechariah noticed, and it stopped him cold. He was mid-sentence, voice low, reading the way he always did on the night shift when the floor went quiet and the storm outside pressed itself flat against the windows. The book was old. Pages soft from use. His voice had settled into a rhythm, steady, almost musical, when the fingers on the bed twitched. Not a muscle spasm. Not the random nerve fire the doctors documented twice a week and ignored. This was deliberate. Zechariah kept reading. His eyes stayed on the page. But every part of him had gone still, the kind of still that trained people go still when they sense something shifting in a room that shouldn't be shifting at all. And he said, "I have been many things. But I have never been wrong about a man's loyalty." The hand shot out. Fast. Locked around Zechariah's wrist like a steel cuff snapping shut. He didn't scream. He didn't drop the book. He stood there, heart slamming against his ribs, and looked down at fingers that hadn't moved on their own in 43 days, squeezing him now with a grip that had no business belonging to a man in a coma. Kedrix Malone didn't open his eyes. His chest rose and fell the same way it always did, measured, machine-assisted, deceptively calm. But his lips moved. One word. Barely a sound. "Agent." The heart monitor blipped. Once. Twice. Then settled back. Like nothing happened. Like a man who had been unconscious for 6 weeks hadn't just spoken directly into the only secret Zechariah carried. Hi viewers, if you were Zechariah right now, what would you do? Stay or run? Drop your answer in the comments, I need to know. Zechariah didn't run. He stood there, wrists still locked in that grip, and did the one thing his training had drilled into him from the beginning. He memorized everything. The pressure of the fingers. The exact word. The way the monitor spiked and then smoothed out like the whole thing had been managed, controlled, from the inside. The grip released on its own. Slow. Deliberate. Like a door closing. Zechariah stepped back. Set the book down on the chair beside the bed. Looked at the man lying there. Big frame, tattoos running up both arms and across his chest, oxygen mask fogging faintly with each breath, and said nothing. He walked out of the room. Pulled out his phone in the hallway. And stared at the last message his handler had sent 3 hours ago. Status compromised. Withdrawal. He hadn't responded yet. Now he understood why it had been sent. The question was no longer whether Kedrix Malone was aware. The question was, how long had he been listening? 3 weeks earlier, Zechariah Osei had walked into Hargrove Medical Center with a badge that said his name, a resume that said his credentials, and a cover story that had been built so clean it didn't have a single loose thread. He wasn't supposed to be in that room. His assignment was Wing C, administrative observation, staff pattern mapping, nothing that required direct patient contact with the man in the private suite on the 4th floor. That man had his own detail. His own doctors. His own lock chart that required 2 passwords and a supervisor override just to open. Zechariah had read it anyway. First week. 3rd night. Shift change at 2 a.m. when the floor supervisor did her rounds and left the station empty for exactly 4 minutes. He'd memorized what he needed and closed it clean. What he found wasn't what they briefed him on. The injury profile didn't match the timeline. The medication levels were off. Not dangerously, not in any way that would flag a routine audit, but off enough that someone who knew what to look for would notice. The coma had been classified as trauma-induced. Blunt force. Complications post-surgery. Except the surgical notes had a gap. 47 minutes? Unaccounted for. Zechariah started choosing room 14 for his rounds the second week. Not because he was assigned there. Because he needed to watch. He told himself that's all it was, observation. Clinical assessment of a subject connected to a federal case that had been running for 2 years and hadn't broken open yet. He brought the book the third week. He told himself that was also strategy. Coma patients respond to auditory stimulation. That was documented, researched, medically sound. If Kedrix Malone was aware on any level, voice exposure could produce measurable responses. That data would be useful. That's what Zechariah told himself. He was still telling himself that the night the wrist grabbed him. Now, standing in the hallway with his phone in his hand, the message from his handler burning on the screen, withdraw, he was no longer sure which parts of the last 3 weeks had been strategy. And which parts had been something he didn't have a clean word for. His phone buzzed again. Same number. 1 word this time. Now. Zechariah looked back at the closed door of room 14. He didn't move toward the elevator. The nurses on the 4th floor didn't talk about Kedrix Malone by name. They called him the patient in 14. Or sometimes just him. Said it in a way that dropped the temperature of a conversation by about 10 degrees. Nobody lingered in that room longer than necessary. Nobody made eye contact with the man in the bed, even though his eyes hadn't opened in 43 days. There was something about the way he occupied space, even horizontal, even unconscious, that made people move carefully around him. Zechariah had noticed that the first day. He'd also noticed that nobody had come to visit. No family. No associates. No flowers, no cards, no phone calls routed through the nurse's station. The federal hold on the room meant standard visitor logs didn't apply, but that didn't explain the absence. Men like Kedrix Malone didn't exist in isolation. They existed at the center of something. Organizations. Loyalties. Structures built on fear and precision. Nobody came because nobody wanted to be seen here. That told Zechariah more than the chart ever had. He'd done his research. Not the sanctioned briefing his handler had walked him through, the actual research. Court records. Sealed indictments. 3 federal cases in 7 years, all of which had collapsed before they reached a jury. Witnesses who stopped cooperating. Evidence that went procedurally wrong at the worst possible moments. Prosecutors who moved to other cities. Kedrix Malone had never been convicted of anything. He'd also never been fully investigated without the investigation eventually falling apart at the seams. Zechariah started noticing the patterns in room 14 the second week. The breathing, it varied. Not randomly. It varied in response to sound. Specific sounds. He tested it without meaning to, the first time he read aloud. A passage about betrayal had produced a long, slow exhale, almost like a sigh. A passage about loyalty had produced a brief, controlled stillness that was somehow more intense than movement. He started paying closer attention. Names made the biggest difference. Not any name. Specific names. Names that appeared in federal case files Zechariah wasn't officially cleared to access. He'd read one, Demarion Cross, during his 3rd visit, buried inside a passage he'd edited slightly on the fly, swapping a fictional character name without skipping a beat. The heart monitor spiked 7 points in under 2 seconds. Then leveled. Like a man catching himself reacting and pulling back. Like a man in control. Zechariah had stood very still after that, staring at the numbers, the book open in his hands. Because that kind of response wasn't autonomic. That was trained. That night, after the wrist, after the word agent, He pulled up the security log for the 4th floor on his personal device. 14 days of footage. He scrolled back to the first night he'd read aloud. He almost missed it. Frame 3847. 2:19 a.m. Room 14. The camera angle caught only the bed, the monitors, the left side of the room. But it caught enough. Kedrix Malone's eyes. Open. Watching the door. Zechariah didn't sleep that night. He sat in the break room with a cold cup of coffee and a folder he wasn't supposed to have, and he worked through it the way he'd been trained. Methodically, without letting the weight of what he was looking at collapse his thinking. The medical records had 4 inconsistencies. Not 3. Not 1. 4, and they weren't random. They formed a pattern, and patterns were never accidental when the subject was someone like Kedrix Malone. First, the blood panel from the night of admission didn't match the panel taken 48 hours later. The variance was small enough to dismiss as lab error. Except Zechariah had worked 2 years in field medicine before he became something else, and he knew the specific markers that shifted that way weren't consistent with trauma. They were consistent with a controlled sedative compound. One not on the standard formulary. Second, the surgeon who performed the emergency procedure on the night of admission had submitted her post-op notes, 6 hours late. Filed as administrative delay. Except her badge logs showed she'd left the building 4 hours before the notes were submitted, and hadn't re-entered. Someone else had filed those notes. Third, the federal hold documentation on Room 14 had 2 authorizing signatures. One was a U.S. Marshal's Office stamp, standard for witness-adjacent cases. The second was a classification code Zechariah recognized because he'd seen it exactly once before, during a briefing he'd been pulled out of early and told to forget. It wasn't a law enforcement classification. It was intelligence. Fourth, and this was the one that made him set the folder down and press both hands flat on the table. The patient admission form listed Kedrix Malone's next of kin as unknown. But 2 lines below that, in a field most people never checked, someone had entered a case file number. Zechariah ran it quietly through a back-channel access point he maintained separately from his official handler line. The case file was sealed. The sealing agency wasn't the FBI. Wasn't the U.S. Marshals. Wasn't DA. He stared at the agency code for a long time. Then he looked up and noticed, for the first time, the small, dark circle of a camera mount above the break room door. It was angled wrong. Not toward the room, the way security cameras were supposed to face. Toward the hallway outside Room 14. Someone else had eyes on this floor. And they weren't hospital security. The boy appeared on a Tuesday. Zechariah was finishing a chart at the nurse's station when he heard it, small footsteps, quick and purposeful, coming from the east stairwell. Not the elevator. The stairs, which required a keycard above the 2nd floor. He looked up. A child, maybe 7, maybe 8, walked out of the stairwell door like he owned the hallway. Dark eyes scanning the room fast, the way kids do when they'd been taught to check their surroundings before they stop moving. He was wearing a gray hoodie, clean sneakers, a small backpack. No emotion on his face that read as lost or confused. He knew exactly where he was going. Zechariah stood up. Hey! The boy walked straight past him. Straight to Room 14. Pushed the door open and stepped inside. Zechariah followed. Because that was his job, because no child should be in that room, because about 6 different protocols had just been broken in the span of 12 seconds. He stopped in the doorway. The boy had pulled the chair close to the bed. He was standing on it, both hands wrapped around one of Kedrix Malone's tattooed forearms, head bent down close to the man's shoulder. Not crying. Not speaking. Just there. Present, the way children are when they belong to someone and they know it without needing to say it. Papa, the boy said quietly. I came. The heart monitor climbed. Not a spike. A steady rise, 6.78. Like a body responding to something the medication wasn't strong enough to fully suppress. Zechariah didn't move from the doorway. He stood there and recalculated everything. Because this changed the shape of what he was looking at. A feared man with no visitors, no family on record, no known emotional connections, had a child. A child who traveled through a secured stairwell on a Tuesday morning without a visible guardian, who walked into a federal hold room without hesitation, who called the most dangerous man Zechariah had ever studied Papa in a voice so ordinary it almost broke something in the air. The boy turned and looked at him. No fear. No surprise. Just those dark, scanning eyes that looked too old. Too aware. The way eyes give when a child has spent their whole short life reading rooms. He knows you read to him, the boy said. Zechariah went still. He told me. The boy looked back at his father. Before the coma. Before the 43 days. Before the sealed files and the mismatched blood panels and the camera pointed at the wrong wall. Zechariah crossed the room slowly and crouched down to the boy's eye level. What's your name? The boy looked at him for a long moment. Messiah. Then he leaned in, small voice, completely calm, and said the one thing that made the floor feel like it dropped 6 inches beneath Zechariah's feet. He's not sleeping. Messiah looked at his father. He's waiting. For what? Messiah didn't answer that. He just reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper, set it on the bed beside Kedrix's hand, and climbed down from the chair. He was out the door before Zechariah could speak again. The paper sat on the bed. Zechariah stared at it. One line. Handwritten. In script too precise to belong to a child. Stop reading the book. Start reading the room. The paper was gone. Zechariah checked twice. Once when he came back from the hallway, once 20 minutes later when he convinced himself he'd imagined the whole thing. But the bed was clean. The space beside Kedrix's hand where that folded note had been sitting was empty, smooth, undisturbed. Nobody else had entered room 14. He'd watched the door the entire time. Which meant one of two things. Either someone had come through an access point he hadn't mapped yet, or the man in the bed had moved it himself. Zechariah pulled up the classified database he wasn't supposed to have keys to anymore, the access point his former unit had never fully revoked because federal bureaucracy moved slow, and he'd banked on that. He typed in a name. Not Kedrix Malone. A different name. One attached to the case file number he'd found buried in the admission form. The result loaded in fragments. Redacted. Redacted. Partial clearance flag. Redacted. Then one line, unredacted, like someone had slipped up. Or left it open on purpose. Subject cardinal, operational status, embedded. Duration, 31 months. Handler classified. Medical cover, authorized. Medical cover. Authorized. Zechariah sat back. He read it again. 31 months. That wasn't a coma. That wasn't a man who'd been ambushed and broken and put on machines to keep him breathing. That was a long game. A very long, very deliberate game, played by someone with the patience and the control to lie still in a hospital bed for 6 weeks while a federal investigation moved around him like water around a stone. His phone buzzed. Handler line. 3 words. Last warning, Ose. He stared at it. Then he looked at the door to room 14. Then he put the phone face down on the table. Stood up. Walked back down the hall. Pushed the door open. Sat down in the chair. Picked up the book. And started reading. Room 14 felt different that night. Zechariah couldn't explain it, not in any clinical way, not in any way that would hold up in a report, but the air in the room had shifted. Something in the weight of the silence. The way the machines seemed louder than usual. Or maybe it was just that everything else had gone very, very quiet. He'd chosen the passage deliberately. Page 211. A conversation between two men who'd been on opposite sides of the same war, who'd finally stopped pretending they didn't know what the other one was. He read it slow. You always knew, the first man said. From the beginning. And the second man didn't deny it. He just looked at him across the room and said, I was waiting to see what you'd do with what you knew. The monitor climbed. Steady. Controlled. 8 points up, and holding there, not spiking, not retreating. Holding, like a man pressing his weight against a door he decided to stop pretending was locked. Zechariah kept reading. The question was never about loyalty, the second man continued. It was about nerve. Anyone can be loyal when it's easy. I needed to know if you'd stay when it costs you something. The grip came without warning. Stronger this time. Both hands on the book, no, one hand on the book, one locked around Zechariah's wrist, and the pressure was different from the first time. That first grab had been a test. This was a statement. Zechariah didn't pull back. He held still and waited. Kedrix's voice was low, rough from weeks of disuse. Like sound being dragged up from somewhere it had been stored very carefully for a very long time. You took too long. 3 words. Zechariah's heart rate was doing things he wasn't going to document. He set the book down. Looked at the man in the bed. Eyes still closed, oxygen mask still in place, every machine in the room lying about what was happening, and said the only thing that made sense to say. Who are you? Silence. Long enough that he started to think the grip would release again. Long enough that he started to think the whole thing would reset, close up, go quiet, leave him standing in the hallway trying to explain to himself what he'd heard. Then Kedrix's mouth moved. Slow. Deliberate. Each word placed with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who's been controlling every single thing about themselves for a very long time. You already know. The grip released. The monitor settled. Zechariah stood there for a full minute before he could make himself move. Because the problem, the real problem, was that Kedrix was right. He did know. He'd known for 3 days. He just hadn't been ready to say it out loud yet. Here's what the briefing hadn't told him. Zechariah's handler, a man named Devonte Cruz who'd recruited him out of a field unit 4 years ago and who communicated exclusively in short sentences and cold precision, had given him a target profile, a cover identity, and exactly one directive. Observe the subject in room 14. Report activity. Do not engage. What Devonte Cruz had not told him was that the subject in room 14 was, himself, an embedded operative. Code name Cardinal. 31 months deep inside the Malone Syndicate. Which meant Kedrix Malone wasn't just a man who'd built a criminal empire. He'd built it as a cover. Layer over layer. Real enough to be feared. Real enough to draw in every major player in a federal case that had been running longer than Zechariah had been part of this unit. The coma was controlled. Not fully. The initial injury had been real, the surgery had been real, the first 2 weeks had been genuinely critical. But the recovery had been managed. Extended. Used. Because from a hospital bed, nobody expected you to be working. And Kedrix Malone had been working the entire time. Zechariah understood it now, the breathing patterns, the heart rate responses, the way specific names produced specific reactions. He hadn't been stimulating a trauma patient with auditory input. He'd been inadvertently running a live intelligence exchange with a man who was using his visits to stay informed. The book wasn't comfort. It was cover. And Zechariah's presence. His nightly reads, his soft voice moving through pages while the floor went quiet, had given Kedrix something nobody else on this floor could provide. Plausible routine. A reason for a nurse to be in that room at 2 a.m. that nobody questioned. That part hit Zechariah somewhere between the ribs, and he didn't examine it closely. Because the next part was worse. He hadn't been assigned to Hargrove Medical Center to monitor Kedrix. He'd been assigned to test him. Devante Cruz and the agency above him needed to know if Cardinal was still clean. 31 months was a long time. Long enough to turn. Long enough for a man to stop knowing which side of himself was real. The embedded agent who built a criminal empire to take it down from the inside. Or the criminal who'd started using federal cover as protection. Zechariah was the test. His access, his questions, the names he'd let slip during readings, none of it was accidental. It had been scripted. Designed to measure how Kedrix responded, what he revealed, whether his reactions were consistent with a man still running an operation or a man who'd gone native. The results had been transmitted back to Devante Cruz every 3 days. Zechariah had been doing his job. And somewhere in the middle of doing his job, he'd stopped being sure whose side he was actually on. Kedrix's voice came back to him. You took too long. Not an accusation. A recognition. He'd been waiting for Zechariah to figure it out. And now that he had, the only question left was what Kedrix intended to do about it. The alert came at 11:47 p.m. Not through the hospital system. Through a frequency Zechariah's personal device had been passively monitoring since his first week at Hargrove, a narrowband signal used by exactly one type of organization. The kind that didn't knock. 3 short pulses. He'd only seen that pattern in training scenarios. It meant active movement toward the location. It meant someone was coming in. Zechariah was out of the break room before the 3rd pulse finished. Down the hall. Through the door of room 14. He didn't stop to think about protocol, or the directive, or the 3 unanswered messages from Devante Cruz sitting on his phone. He moved because moving was the only logical thing. Kedrix was already different. Not dramatically. Not in any way the machines would show. But Zechariah had been in this room enough nights to know the difference between a man at rest and a man at ready, and everything about Kedrix right now read as ready. The hands flat on the mattress. The breathing slower, more deliberate. The stillness of someone who was choosing to be still rather than someone who had no other option. They're moving, Zechariah said. Quiet. Controlled. The monitor climbed 2 points. Eastern entry. 30 minutes, maybe less. A pause. Zechariah crossed the room. Stood at the window. Looked down at the parking structure across the street and counted 3 vehicles that hadn't been there an hour ago. Dark. No plates visible from this angle. 3 vehicles was not a social call. He turned back to the room. I can get Messiah out. He's still in the building. I tracked the keycard use, he hasn't left. But I need to know if there's a second exit from this floor that isn't on the hospital blueprints. He was talking to a man in a medically induced partial coma. He was also completely certain the man heard every word. The right hand moved. Slow, deliberate. Kedrix raised 2 fingers from the mattress and pointed. East wall. Supply corridor. Behind the linen shelving unit that sat in the far corner of the room and hadn't been moved in the 3 years the hospital had occupied this building. Zechariah stared at it. Then he crossed the room, moved the shelving unit 6 inches to the right, and found the seam in the drywall. A door. Old construction. Smooth handle, no lock, hinged inward. He looked back at Kedrix. The hand had lowered. But the breathing had changed again. Longer inhales. Controlled output. The kind of pattern a man runs when he's preparing his body for something it hasn't done in 43 days. Zechariah grabbed the keycard from his badge and moved for the door. Then stopped. Turned back one more time. Messiah said you're waiting? He kept his voice low. Waiting for what? The room was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then Kedrix's eyes opened. Not slowly. Not like a man coming up from sleep. All the way. Fully. Sharp and dark and completely, devastatingly alert. Like someone had turned the lights on in a room that had been dark for 43 days, and the room had been ready the whole time. He looked straight at Zechariah. No confusion. No adjustment period. Just locked in. Direct. Present in a way that made the air feel different. His voice was still rough. Still dragged up from somewhere it had been held. But there was nothing uncertain in it. South corridor. Level B. 3 guards. One of them is ours. He said it like a briefing. Like a man who'd been running this in his head for 6 weeks, waiting for the moment he'd need to say it out loud. Zechariah absorbed it. Nodded once. And moved. Kedrix Malone sat up at 12:03 a.m. Nobody helped him. He pulled the oxygen mask off first. Set it aside without looking at it. Then the 4-line, careful, controlled, then the monitor leads, one by one, each removal precise enough that the alarms didn't trigger. Like a man who knew exactly how much time he had and was using every second of it. He swung his legs off the bed. Sat there for a moment. Just breathed. 43 days on his back, and when he stood, it wasn't slow. It wasn't the careful, testing weight shift of a man who wasn't sure his body would hold. It was steady. Deliberate. The kind of movement that said the body had been ready for a while, and was simply now being given permission. He was still in a hospital gown. He looked down at himself. Then, without a visible change of expression, he walked to the supply closet in the corner of the room. The one Zechariah hadn't checked because it was marked biohazard linens and nobody opened those unnecessarily, and pulled it open. Inside, clothes. His. Folded. Boots. A jacket. Someone had put them there. Someone had planned this. He dressed without hurry. Checked the window. Checked the door. Then stood in the center of the room and listened. Not with the exaggerated stillness of a man straining to hear, but with the natural, settled attention of someone for whom reading a room was as automatic as breathing. Footsteps. East corridor. Moving fast. 2 sets. One of them, Zechariah. He knew the pattern. 3 weeks of listening had given him that. The other set was heavier. Uneven gait, right side dominant. Someone compensating for an older injury. He'd already placed the name before the door opened. Zechariah came through first. Messiah was behind him, small hand wrapped around 2 of Zechariah's fingers, dark eyes scanning the room and landing immediately on his father with an expression that was not surprise, not relief, just recognition. The look of a child who'd been told something would happen and was now watching it happen exactly as described. Kedrix crossed the room, crouched down to Messiah's level, put both hands on the boy's face, looked at him for 3 full seconds. Something moving through his expression that had no name and didn't need one, and then stood back up. He looked at Zechariah. Zechariah looked back. Either of them spoke for a moment. Then Kedrix said, "You stayed." Not a question. Not an accusation. Just a statement. Delivered the way a man delivers something that matters when he's not the kind of man who says things that matter out loud very often. "Even when you knew." Zechariah didn't respond. There wasn't anything clean to say to that. He'd stayed because the job required it, and then he'd stayed because something else required it, and he wasn't prepared to stand in a hospital room at midnight and sort out which one had been running the decision by the end. Kedrix let the silence hold for one more beat. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. The smallest possible version of something that might have been called, in a different life, a smile. "That makes you dangerous." He moved toward the door. Checked the corridor. Came back. Then he leaned in, not close, not in the way that required Zechariah to step back, but close enough that when he spoke, it was only for the two of them. "Next time." A pause. "Don't pretend you're just a nurse." Zechariah held his gaze. Kedrix held it back. Then, "Partner." He stepped out into the corridor. Messiah looked up at Zechariah, those 2 old eyes, that small steady face, and said nothing. Just turned and followed his father. Zechariah stood alone in room 14 for exactly 4 seconds. Then he followed too. Because that was, apparently, who he was now. And the terrifying part, the part he couldn't argue with, standing in the empty room with the machine still running and the book still open on the chair, was that he wasn't sure he'd ever been anything else. Speech alone, that ending. "Partner. Did you see it coming, or did it hit different than you expected?" Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know which moment broke you first. Was it Messiah walking into that room? Was it the eyes opening? Or was it that last word? This story is proof that the most powerful connections aren't the ones you choose. They're the ones that choose you, no matter how hard you try to stay professional. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this, ones that hit deep, that carry real emotion, real tension, and characters you actually feel, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Every story we put out is built to stay with you. You don't want to miss what's coming next. See you in the next chapter.